Join the conversation with Tommy Weber. Pro and college baseball coach Tommy Weber brings you cutting-edge interviews and thought-provoking commentary in a weekly podcast dedicated to baseball, sports, current events, and the world. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and TommyWeberBaseball.com. And make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Tommy Weber Baseball. It's time to get the conversation started, so here's your host, Tommy Weber.
From the Bolt Studio on the Staten Island campus of St. John's University, produced by our talented team of sport management undergrads. I'm Tommy Weber. This is The Conversation, bringing you insights, perspective, and, of course, lots of opinions on our baseball and sports culture. Today's guest is Linda Flanagan. Linda is a freelance journalist, researcher, and former cross-country and track coach. She's a graduate of Lehigh University. Linda holds master's degrees from Oxford and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and was an analyst for the National Security Program at Harvard. More importantly, Linda wrote this fabulous book called Take Back the Game: How Money and Mania Are Ruining Kids' Sports and Why It Matters. Welcome aboard, Linda Flanagan.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, as we've texted and emailed, I expressed to you how poignant I felt reading your book was. I'm sorry, I listened to your book. But it was a wonderful companion for me on car rides everywhere, because I just kept getting to places where it so hit home. It was so on point, so accurate, based on my experience in baseball and in sports in general. And this conversation that I've been having for 25 years. And I thought one of the poignant pieces in your book is when you and your son, I think it was an AAU basketball tryout or showcase or whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
And it was a rainy day and you were exhausted and he was, complaining and not happy. And you basically said, "What are we doing here?"
Yes.
Please expound, please.
Well, okay, so he was at that point a junior in high school and had been playing varsity basketball for 2 years already. He's a fine player. He wasn't going to play at some advanced level. He's not even 6 feet tall. He's a good player, great high school player. And somehow I got it in my head that, well, maybe AAU, we should maybe try that. And he was on board with it. We were sort of both kind of like, whatever, let's try it. And almost from the get-go, he could tell and I could tell that it was a bloodless activity, in that, the kids didn't really know each other. They were from different parts of New Jersey. The coach didn't really seem to know the kids. It was all very haphazard and impersonal. And what prompted that epiphany that I wrote about and that you refer to in the book is happened at the first AAU game in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when, we got up early, drove out there looking for Dunder Mifflin, I should add, without success. And, I'm sitting there in the stands. It's like cold. He's sort of sitting there. Nobody knows anybody. The parents I don't even know which parents are attached to which team. He played some, he sat, the whole thing, the whole thing was just so colossally pointless. It just struck me when I was sitting there. And when Paul, that's my son's name, when we trudged back to the car, he said, "I hated that." And it was like, a bolt of lightning. I'm like, we're done with it. Like, this is just, what is this for? This is not doing anything for anyone. I don't know who it was for, but it certainly wasn't for my son or my family. And meanwhile, the rest of my family was back home. Like, that was the end of that. And I'm glad we figured it out. Too bad we hadn't earlier, but at least we weren't all that enmeshed in it at the time.
When you say it's pointless, I say this a lot about the entire travel team showcase AAU culture that has proliferated since what I would call about early to mid 90s is when this really started to take off.
Mm-hmm.
I remember sitting in the dugout on a beautiful day and saying to a colleague of mine who just so happened he had been Nolan Ryan's roommate in A-ball, and he was a
Mm.
mentor of mine, and we coached together. And I said, Mike, everything's changing. I don't can't quite put my finger on it, but everything is changing. And that was like crazy parents at games, and I hear kids were getting lessons at the time, and nobody really ever got a lesson. There was no such thing as a lesson. You learned
Yeah.
what you learn best by playing with your friends, and you were good one day and bad the next, and trying to play with older kids and all that other stuff, and logging a lot of time. Anyway, so when you say to me, uh, pointless, impersonal, I start to think of words like intimacy, like how do you form these really intimate bonds with anyone that I certainly did, you did as an athlete, which are really the enduring pieces of
Mm-hmm.
participating in sports. That's what's enduring.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Nobody's going to
Yeah.
get rich. Nobody's going to make the major leagues. The percentages are too low, and if you do, you have to be a genetic freak to do so. But
Right.
the time you're
Exactly.
6 till the time you're 16 or 17, this should be all about your development as a person. And
Yes.
when you say that, I just don't see that happening.
No. Well, and I think it's because sports have become, a means to another end. They're a way. They're like a plot point to get to college, to get kids to a better college, to the idea of maybe they'll get a scholarship. I think that's actually overstated. I don't think that's really the driver so much of this. I think what's driving the excess and the clubs is that sports, people can see that it's a means to perhaps get into a better college than they otherwise would have for kids. Parents are very anxious about that. It seems to be harder and harder to get into any school. The cost is astronomical. So it's like it's it's kind of a shortcut. And at the same time, I think there's just tremendous, like, a social contagion about some of the club stuff. Depending on where you live, in my community, it's just the thing you do. And so there's not really a lot of thought about what's this for, and why are we doing this, and is this achieving anything whatsoever? And then it takes on a life of its own, and it's impossible to get out. But like you say, those relationships that you can form with as an athlete with a coach, and vice versa, and an athlete with your teammates, that's all kind of washed away, or at least greatly diminished, when kids are pulled in all these different directions and thrown together with unknowns.
You make a fabulous point in your book that really hits home. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. Um, you talk about uh, parent paranoia proliferating over the last 30 years about child safety. I
Yeah,
firmly believe that the tipping point for almost all of this was when Eton Patz's
I knew
parents
you were going to say that. Yep.
uh, allowed him to walk to school, which we all did. I walked to school when I was 6 and 7. Please, everyone did, um, and never returned. I believe at that point in time, being the first kid on the milk carton, that convinced every single American parent that if you take your eyes off your kid, you will never see him again. And
Yeah.
I think that set into motion a series of events. One was video games, because parents loved video games because it gave their kids, they knew where the kids were all the time. That
Yep.
created high anxiety kids. That created overweight kids. And that created the travel ball, family, team Billy, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
dynamic that we experience today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, certainly, there's the stranger danger, that
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Get it?
Um, Technical
Well,
difficulties.
that will be edited in the final one. That will be edited. Don't worry.
um, you know, it's the stranger danger worry is such a fascinating social development, because as gotten, as uh, the danger to kids has declined, there's more worry, there's more fear about it. There's more
I
fear
agree.
that kids are never going to come back. And in fact, it's safer now than it ever was.
I agree.
So that was a phenomenon, the milk carton kids. And there are other related factors that I also write about in the book, like the recession in the 70s got parents really nervous about, you know, the economy, the future, were their kids ever going to make it? And then parents had fewer kids, so they became more scarce and more precious. And divorce rates went up, so parents, families are split up, and everyone is so nervous. And I think that remains true now. Like parents are just so nervous about what they're doing, and I get it. I mean, I think no parent honestly knows what they're doing. You just kind of figure it out. But and if everybody else is doing these, travel teams for their 6-year-old, well, who are you to say I know better? I mean, I understand that, but it's people are being kind of preyed on to some extent, and it's not in the kids' interest.
That's for sure. When it's interesting because what you've really done is you've suspended common sense, and I use this analogy. Although you may know nothing about sports and you may know nothing about how to get into college, you also don't know anything about when you take your kid to a doctor. But if your kid had the sniffles and the doctor said we want to cut his ear off, you'd walk out of the doctor's office. Your common sense would
Hmm.
kick in, even though you know
Yeah.
nothing about how to be a doctor. Yet with sports, it's very unique. That common sense instinct doesn't seem to kick in. Like, why am I paying some guy who was a crappy ball player, who has a
Hmm.
beard and a gun that he could, clock my son's velocity, $100 to teach my kid how to play baseball? Why would I
Hmm.
do that when I could do the same thing by just having a catch with him in the backyard?
Well, because everyone else is doing it apparently, and look, if I can afford it, maybe it'll give him an edge. And I don't want him to think he doesn't love me or I don't support his sports. I mean, I think this is the kind of thinking about it. And, you know, there is this idea that if you start, that more is better, that starting earlier is better, that you get a little bit of a head start. And even if we know that that isn't true, particularly with regard to sports, it's hard to resist that temptation.
Right, right. It is very, very difficult. One of the other really poignant passages in the book speaks to connection
Hmm.
and how young people, especially adolescents, find a deep sense of connection through team sports.
Hmm.
And you really beautifully write about, uh, I think the young woman was a track and field athlete and
Hmm.
loses her brother and her father
Yes.
in the same season, and the degree to which she was comforted by her teammates, and how
Hmm.
valuable that is
Right.
as sort of a way to point out what really is important about team
Yeah.
sports. Just
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. That girl, her name is Allie Carter. I coached her many, many years ago. And when she was actually a freshman in high school, her brother died suddenly in a car accident. And it was understandably very traumatic. She had a close family. And it was as difficult as you could imagine. And she said it was really her connection with her teammates that got her through, and also the physical, which is really also very important, I think, the physical outlet she had with sports, dealing with the grief. It helped her so much to have this outlet, throwing the ball and catching. Like school was harder because she get distracted, but the sports were a wonderful outlet for that grief. And then her friends just were so wonderful. Then that happened when she was a freshman. When she was a junior, her father, it was discovered that he had cancer. Uh, it was a kind of skin cancer that had metastasized to his brain. And he died when she was a senior in high school. And, you know, she talks so eloquently about how it was her teammates who got her through. She's very close to her mother, but her mother was distraught as well and at the hospital all the time. But it was her teammates who were there for her, who brought her to practice, who got her, picked out prom clothes for her. They gave her a surprise party. They're the ones she felt this connection to, that they are the ones who brought her through. And, you know, that's why we have sports. I mean, because they're a form of a special kind of bond. They allow for a special kind of bond with young people, and also between coaches and young people. I think coaches can have a very unique kind of relationship with the kids they coach that the kids don't necessarily or often don't have with their teachers, because it's a different kind of relationship. Sports are emotional. We coaches see them when they're high and low, and there are tears and there's jubilation, and you're there with them during that, and you feel it often yourself when you're the coach, and that just creates these unique attachments. And that's what's so valuable about sports, and that's what we're losing when we turn them into a vehicle to get into a better college, or just following along with everyone else.
I feel like the word I like to use with respect to that is the commoditizing of sports, where we have literally uh, created a system where I think that if I pay uh, for something, that I need to get something back in return. It becomes a commodity that's I trade my baseball for a college scholarship. I trade
Yeah.
my track and field for a spot on the AAU team. And again, getting back to the personalization, it becomes a really cold kind of science that I
Yeah.
don't believe is very enduring at all.
Yeah. Well, it becomes transactional at that point.
Very much so. Very much so.
And and the clubs and the private stuff that interferes, in my view, with what ought to be the focus, which is high school sports. I think it's the school sports are where the lessons are truly learned and where the benefits accrue. The increase in the number of club teams has just created more friction between coaches and parents, coaches and kids, because there's so many conflicts, and I got to be at this game, and I got to leave practice early because I got to, you know, this is something you're well aware of, but that's what's lost when it becomes about, when again, the term I use is, sports become a means for another end, not the end that sports provide, the wonderful value that they provide in their own right.
Yeah. I have a personal story that's just so appropriate here. I mean, in 2017, we had a wonderful team up in the Cape, and our baby center fielder was experiencing a real crisis in his life. His mother was diagnosed with very early onset Alzheimer's. And I mean, I've been around the game my whole life, and I've had good teams and bad teams with good guys and bad guys, and not every team is special, and not every kid is special. But the first day that we convened, I saw that kids were writing on their shoes "for mom," uh,
Oh,
and I was like, "What is this?"
oh, that's so
And they
nice.
they literally adopted this kid, and I did as well. He's a very dear friend of mine to this day, and I love him. But what he was going through, I really believe, uh, as horrible as it was, she was in her early 50s. I really believe that the connection to his teammates, his brothers, as they became, really helped him through what would become, the darkest point in his life.
Yeah. Yep.
Even though he was a magnificent athlete, who was going to make a lot of money and get drafted and all that, obviously that meant nothing in the face of the fact that you're losing your mom.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
agree with you. What I guess my question to you, I mean, you're super smart, and the book is great. Let's get the book in there again. Let's keep getting books. You want to plug the
I
book, buy it, read it. You don't care if we listen to it or read it. Just buy it, okay?
That's it.
Uh, uh, but we kind of know, or at least I think I know, where this all starts, and where how we got where we are today. The question is, what do we do now? Uh, how do we change course? Um, in the best interest of young people who are participating in sports, parents, coaches?
Yeah.
Give us some suggestions. What would you do?
Well, what I would do, I think, first of all, is try to get a little educated. I think parents, starting with parents, need to be educated about what's going on, like how we got here, why it is the way it is, with the money and the college stuff and this like weird feeling that our kids are a reflection of us, that their success is our success,
That's deep.
which is something that is.
That's deep.
Say
That's
again.
very deep.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, I think, yeah, it's true
It is
though.
true. You're right. You're right.
That everything, it feels like it's such a reflection. So that's why we parents get so emotionally invested. Um, but I think, we can't wait for the system to change because um, it's not going to change by the time your kids are grown. If you've got 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, by the time it changes, if it ever does, your kids will be out of the house. So I think in the meantime, I think parents need to reclaim their agency in this and not and resist. Honestly, it's about resisting some of the stuff, having the courage to say, to trust their common sense. It says this isn't wise. This isn't helping my child. And part of that education means understanding what the consequences are of all this play, which you well know. Not only just this, the neutered teams or in the, weak relationships with coaches and kids, but the longer term effects on kids with the injuries and etc. Um, but I think it has to start with parents resisting, saying, we're not going to do that. And if they feel that the kid is like, feels desperate and has to do some of this, well, then keep it, put boundaries around it so that it doesn't take over their lives or the family, the family calendar. And I think to get any momentum, parents need to kind of organize with other parents as well and say, look, I suspect that in many homes, their parents are not happy about having to travel every
Oh,
weekend
God.
or drive, hours and hours for a single game that might get rained out. And if they're willing to organize with other parents and like say resist and like, can we and talk to the coach and talk to the league and say, can we scale it back? There's this fear of like scaling it back because they're going to be left behind. And that is just, in most cases, that just isn't true. So it starts with parents, I think, resisting, organizing, getting on boards of organizations, um, feeling emboldened enough to say, we're not doing this. No, thank you. We're not going to make that tournament over Mother's Day. So that's the first. And I think coaches, if I were advising a coach at a high school level, I would say be sure you're at a high school where you have the backing of the athletic director and the board of ed. In that, you know, if you're going to be focused mainly on the well-being of the kids, the well-being of the players, their development as human beings. Meanwhile, of course, you want to win. Coaches don't go into coaching to lose. Of course, you want to win, but your primary purpose is the development of these young people. And I have your backing, AD, right? So if a parent comes at me and says, I'm not doing enough for X, Y, and Z, or why didn't we join that, play that game, or why isn't my child playing shortstop, then that you'll have the backing of the school. Because if you're at a place, if you're trying to coach in a league or at a school where that's not a priority, then you're going to be miserable and you're not going to get anywhere and it'll be a battle.
So you're talking about,
What do you think?
well, what do I think? I think everything you said is spot on. I would submit that in practice, I've had thousands of conversations. I am in group chats and I speak to teams and parents all the time. And when I speak to, when someone asks me to speak to a team of 14-year-old kids and parents, I always warn them. I said, they're going to really like me a lot for about 8 minutes. Because in those 8 minutes, I'm going to give them stories and I'm going to talk to them about great players, and they love that part of it. Then's going to come the part where I
Yep.
start to talk about the reality of sports, both at the college level and, of course, at the professional level. The likelihood of your son getting a
Mm-hmm.
scholarship to play baseball is very low. And if he does get a scholarship, he's going to get a very partial scholarship. The kid sitting next to him who does well in academics is probably getting the same amount of money in aid that your son who plays baseball is getting. That's the truth. And
Yes.
if you really want to get your kid a full
Yes.
scholarship, teach him to play the trombone, because every band needs a trombone player, and he'll get a full scholarship. So at that point, when I start to discuss the reality, I see people turning off, because everyone thinks you're talking about the other kid, not my kid.
Yeah.
And you make a very
Yeah.
salient point. I use the analogy of the gift bag at the birthday party. That gift bag may have crap in it, but you're not leaving until your kid gets the gift bag, because every other kid has it. And that's a very
Hmm.
powerful, compelling dynamic to the 21st century
Yeah.
parent that my parents didn't have. I must say that. I believe
Yes.
the sea change is as much in parenting as it is in anything
Yeah.
else, because I don't know, my parents didn't know where I was for 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
They just
Yeah.
didn't. And
Right.
they didn't come to
Right.
every game, and they weren't as vested
Hmm.
in my sports as me and my friends were. I mean, we were vested, but my
Yeah.
parents, they
Yeah.
had other things to do. And I believe that Madison Avenue has convinced a generation of parents that the benchmark of your parenting is the degree to which you martyr yourself for your kids. You can't do enough. And that's a tough
Yeah.
rabbit hole to go down.
It is. It is. Well, and I think there needs to be like the paradigm shift about that as well, about what do we owe our kids? What do we parents owe our kids? And what do we owe ourselves and our marriage, if we're in a marriage, our other kids in the family?
Touch on that. That's a great point. Talk
Our
about the other kids, because I used to say this all the time. Why are the other
uh,
three kids at the game? I mean, what are they getting out of this? Please, your book
yeah,
eloquently
I know.
addresses that. And by the way, again,
Yes.
this
Well,
book. This is the book. Everybody's got to buy this book.
and appreciate that. Well, yes. So there's a shockingly small amount of research on the effect of sports, youth sports, competitive youth sports on families, on marriages, and on siblings. However, there is the little that I have come across, and I've spoken to one of the main research in this, is that it's his particular study looked at when an older sibling was a very good athlete, and the younger, and how did this affect the younger sibling? And he found that the younger sibling went in one of two ways. He either emulated the older sibling, in other words, like, wow, if I guess that's the way to go if I want to get mom and dad's attention, I better be an athlete. Or the younger sibling differentiated and said, well, I'm not going to be good, so I better take up trombone. Um, and what's interesting about that is I think the sports are kind of the defining feature for the sibling, even though he is not the one playing the sport. But I also understand, and in fact, I think the best uh, explanations of how it feels like to be a younger sibling or an older sibling who's not a great athlete, and one of the kids is often found in novels, because that's where you see it. They really get into it. It's not data; it's in novels. Because I'm sorry, if you have kids and they are so acutely sensitive to even the slightest lack of equality in parental attention, resources. So if you were as a mother or father and just prostrating yourself to one kid so that that one child can succeed or shine, the other kids, it can't help but have a massive effect on the other kids. Do they come along? Do they get dragged along? Do they get left behind? It's just, it's inevitable that it's going to have a massive impact and affect those sibling relationships.
This is heresy. But is it possible? Because care and love are very different. Care takes resources.
Hmm.
If you have lots of resources, it's easy to care for someone. It's much easier to care for
Hmm.
someone. So if you have tons of resources, you could give tons of care. Love is a little different. Love usually hurts. Love is that thing that, you put your kid on the bus for the first time and you don't want to do it, but you have to do it. Usually that's a loving act. Is it possible that we've kind of corrupted care and that we are literally drowning our kids in care? That like we are almost
Mm.
over caring. Like my Italian grandfather had a tomato garden. I used to wonder why he always just would pluck at them and then like back off. And I asked him one day and he told me, if I have a shadow over the tomato plant, it can't grow. And I was like, wow,
That's a great
what a great
analogy.
analogy. And I use that with my players all
Yeah.
the time, in that I want to back off so that you guys can grow. I want it to be like, you interact more with each
Yeah.
other and find your way so that your self-esteem skyrockets because you're self-reliant. Well, this is not a formula for high self-esteem, and it's all steeped in I care so much about my kid.
Hmm. Yeah. 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 I think, there's if you're aware of the free range kids
Yes, Lenore
movement, and now it's
Shkenazi.
called Let
Yes,
Grow. Yes. That's her basic
yes.
premise, that we've we've gotten our little tentacles into every aspect of their lives, aided by technology, and so now kids have gotten the impression or the sense that they can't do anything without checking in with mom and dad and making sure it's okay, and is this the right thing to do. And I it makes sense to me, and I think that's one explanation for why we have such anxious kids now, who just are so tentative and don't know what they're doing and are so depressed because they've been, you know, there's been a puppeteer kind of calling the shots for them. So it is care. I think it's well
Yes, it
intended.
is.
I think it's, well, there's a lot of anxiety behind it, like the stranger danger. I better, keep tabs on where my child is at every second, make sure their grades are, we can now monitor kids' grades through, what is that app at school? I can't remember what it's called. Like parent, we have so much more access to our kids' lives as parents than your parents or my parents did. I mean, it was like we got a report card once every,
Right.
2 months, and that was
Right.
it.
Yes.
And now it's like, oh, did you hand in that assignment that was due yesterday in your history class? I see it's marked 0 right now. Like that kind of over involvement is obviously true in sports in spades.
So how so you're my coach, right? You're coaching the coach, if you will. I've my idea has always been, and perhaps this is just a reflection of my own experience as a kid, as an athlete, as a player, and then as a coach and a man, whatever I did. Um, I was I was the second in line in my family. I had a brother. My brother's 4 years older than I am, and in kid years, that's forever. Like my brother never
Yeah.
wanted me to play with him, and you know, and I had to be better to play with my brother and his friends, because then his friends wanted me to play, and my brother didn't have as much of a say. And what I want to create
Yeah.
with my players, by allowing them to sort of mingle and have this jam session, baseball jam session, if you would, is to sort of grow in that way, so that you chart your own course. I'll be there to guide you a little bit and make sure you don't go off the rails.
Yeah.
But in essence, ha, A, do you like that? And B, how do we get more of that? Like throw out the bats and balls
Hmm.
and let them choose up sides and play for hours on end, rather than having a 2-hour time limit, or having 9 coaches on the field with 11-year-olds. I mean, what
Gosh.
a drag.
Uh, I know it really is. Well, I mean, I think you just got to do it. Like you say, you just got to do it. You know, I mean, as a coach, and hope that you have buy-in from the parents. And just again, it's about getting the message out, um, and hoping that people will see the benefits of it. And what's interesting, what you just said about you being kind of backing off and letting them sort of figure it out. I also write for an education site, so I've done a lot of work in education. And this is what's happening in the classroom. There's a giant movement away from the teacher at the head of the class saying, okay, to get your notebook out and listen to my wisdom. Now there has been this movement towards getting kids to be responsible for their own learning. Like, here I am, I'm here to help you, and I can show you how to do this problem, and now you're going to do it, and I'm here like a guide on the side, but I'm not filling your head with facts. You're going to find that, like, information is ubiquitous. There's everyone has a phone. Google tells you everything. So that whole notion that you can be responsible for your own learning, I think, is also applicable to sports, and it sounds like that's kind of exactly what you're talking
I
about.
know you're pressed for time, but I got to give you this example. So baseball is the perfect template for this. What's happened in baseball is baseball has become all about delivering information to the players, as much information as you could possibly give them. So what happens is you have this kind of top-down passive learning where the player waits for the next piece of information, and then he's expected to process that in a way that's going to be productive to him. And I'm like, wait a second, I could make an argument for no information. Let the player develop on his own. First of all, he has all the information in the palm of his hand. He's got a phone just like you do. I would rather the
Yeah.
players get together and themselves sort of mine the information, dig for it, because the act of digging for it is as instructive and as beneficial as anything you're going to do for them. That's going to give them the tool, the awareness, the ability to act for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and obviously the same applies in the classroom, like, and having the wherewithal to do the search, having the wherewithal to figure it out, to find out because you want to know the answer rather than having somebody, drop it in your head and hope it sticks. Because it's not going to stick, most likely. If someone is telling you, I mean, it's like the Peanuts cartoon with the adults at the head of the room, just,
Right.
blah,
Right.
blah,
Right.
blah in the background.
But when you think about it, Linda, the paradigm for baseball does mimic the parent paradigm, because what you're really saying is this:
Hmm.
if you're a helicopter parent, there's only one place you could ever be safe, and that's if I'm there. And the other message you send is that you're not capable. You're not capable if I don't
Yes.
give it to you. If I don't give you the information, player, then you are not capable. And those are two things I would never want to do to my players. I don't want them to be afraid. And I want them to
Yeah.
think that they have it, that they can do it, that they don't need me. I want to emancipate them.
Yes. Yes. Right. Yeah. Well, that's enlightened coaching. That's what I call enlightened
Well,
coaching.
I'm an enlightened guy. I'm going to show this clip to my wife. I am now, if Linda Flanagan says you're enlightened, you are enlightened. And by the way, again, can't do this enough. This is the book you got to get. Listen to it, read it. If you're a parent involved in the game, in any game, whether it's hockey, track and field, girls, boys, whatever, this is the book you really do need to read. You need to see why we got here, how we got here, and perhaps how we could move from where we are to a place that's better, not only for our our kids, the players, but for ourselves as well. I know that
Mhm.
you have a busy schedule. I would love to have you back because, as I said to you in my text, I could talk about this for days, for days.
Yeah.
You are,
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to come
yeah,
back.
you are everything that I thought you would be, and I can't tell you what a delight this has been, and kind of a little bit of a therapy session as well.
Well, we both got to vent.
um, but you're a lot less expensive than my therapist, so.
All right. Same time next week.
But I can't thank you enough. Again, Linda Flanagan, the book, you've got to get it. Really a delight having you. Thank you so much. On behalf of my
Thank
students,
you.
St.
It's
John's,
my
and everyone
pleasure.
else, thanks so much, Linda.
All right. My pleasure. And good luck,
Thank you
students.
so
Thank you.
much. Yeah.